Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. Indian Arrival Day is observed on May 30. We're very happy to be speaking with Senior Lecturer of Indian History and Indian Diaspora Studies in the Department of History at the University of the West Indies St Augustine campus, Dr. Singh. She joins us to explore past some of the usual conversations that are had at this time. Namaskar, Dr. Singh. Thank you so much for making the time. How you do?
Thank you, Mr. Rostant. Namaskar. Thank you for having me this morning. I'm fine.
And one of the things I find interesting is that many times when we are looking at Indian Arrival Day, we talk about the draw, and the possible pros, the faith, the belief in themselves, and a better life that individuals would have had to leave and come to Trinidad. Talk to us a little bit about some of the factors that would have been driving people from the space that they were in, from loved ones, those push factors. What would some of them be?
I'm quite happy that you're asking that question, Mr. Rostant, because one of the commonly held ideas of Indian indenture system is that it was a voluntary movement. I will say at the outset, definitely it was no way near as involuntary or as restrictive as African enslavement. But it also was not an absolutely voluntary system. There were shades of unfreedom in this system. I'll explain. So you asked about push factors. When we look at the push factors from India, we see that almost all of the push factors were created by British colonialism, because by that time, by 1840s, the British, they were acquiring control of substantial portions of India for maybe around 100 years. So, and they employed various strategies to further their control of India. And many of those strategies, if not all of those strategies, were to the detriment of the Indian population. So, for example, in terms of specific push factors for Indian indenture, the British had essentially impoverished India in many ways. So by the time you got to the 1830s, you had a huge glut in the Indian labor market. They had created a situation of impoverishment to the extent that people would do almost anything for another meal. So for example, they had destroyed Indian industries. Prior to British rule in India, India had budding international textile industry, cotton industry, but the British demolished this industry so that their goods could come into India and be sold to Indians, so that their mills and so forth, their businesses in Britain could flourish. They also appropriated Indian lands. So India was a highly agriculture-based society prior to the British entry. Indian land was not private property. There were rights over the land. But when the British came, they, of course, the first thing that they did in each area that they acquired control of is that they imposed very high, exorbitant taxation rates. And of course, when Indians could not pay those taxes, they took the lands from them. So by doing that alone, there was a huge glut in the labor market. You had landless labor. In addition to that, land that was used to produce food, it was now channeled into the production of cash crops like cotton and poppy for the production of opium and sugarcane, all cash crops, all geared towards profits, various kinds of taxations and so on. So I would say you have a lot more, but I would say that definitely the main push factors stem from British rule in India. Because if you look at Indian history, historically speaking, Indians were not a migrating people. They would move to various parts of India, and India is very large. There were systems in place, various agricultural systems, where they would move, let's say, for 6 months, a year, but they would come back home. The idea was that they were leaving to return. The furthest they might go for that is Sri Lanka, but to return. So the push factors were created by the British. in terms of impoverishment. So around the time of Indian indenture, they simply would now employ certain strategies on an already weakened population, weakened as in weak-minded, because you're impoverished, you're looking for a meal. So then you had the other strategy of recruitment, a lot of which, especially until the 1870s, would have been based on deception, various forms of deception and trickery, blatant lies. There was also evidence of physical kidnappings of women and younger, like teenage males and so forth. Okay, but this would decline. This sort of deception would decline after the 1870s when people became more aware of the system. Various stories were told. They were told that they were going to sift sugar, which was easy work. Yeah. So with that stark impoverishment, together with the stories and the various levels of deception in the recruitment process, when you look at it, you realize that it wasn't as voluntary as it was made out to be. Also, if you look at the contract doesn't stipulate most of the conditions on the estate. They stipulated the wages, the hours of work, they did not stipulate, and these are very important, they did not stipulate to the Indians that they could not leave the estates without permission. So that in itself, the fact that the Indians could not leave on the estates to move out, even to go and visit someone else on another estate without written permission, that in itself is a form of unfreedom. And in addition to that, they were only allowed to leave the estates twice per year. So their movement was severely restricted. That was not made clear in the contract. The contract said nothing about punishment for various crimes and so forth. You also have to remember that there were times when the contract said something, but that wasn't followed through. So males were supposed to be paid 25 cents per day, women a lot less. But there were in many instances, and this was the norm, that wages were withheld. Sometimes they were paid lower, sometimes the hours of work were extended, sometimes the wages were withheld for months on end. And when they did fuss about it or even went on strike, then usually they would not be paid, let's say, the full 3 months or 6 months that would have been owed to them. Okay? So when we talk about Indians leaving, we have to consider all of this. And then a very important factor in this is that Indians were told that they were going to return to India. They were told that there would be a return passage that would be provided to them. So while the Indians were, whether in the Caribbean, whether in Fiji, Mauritius, and so forth, while they were in their periods of indenture, whether 5 or 10 years, British policies started to change. Regulations and rules started to change. And the British authorities realized that it was more expensive to have the Indians moving back and forth, to have to pay these return trips back and forth. It was cheaper and more profitable to them to keep the Indians there. So the Indians left with the idea that they were going to return, but along the way, again, emphasis on maximization of profits, the British realized that they would profit more if they kept the Indians, certain groups of Indians. So to have them there already, not having to pay passages back and forth. So the Indians, in a sense, they had to make themselves into settlers because of the various conditions that faced them. And you have to remember, in all of this, the Indians could not read or write English. So they basically knew of the contract, what was told of them. They couldn't read it. So as the contracts kept changing and the rules, let's say, for example, pertaining to the return passage kept changing, they were confused. So like they were promised a free return passage back. Then it eventually changed to, okay, you had to pay a portion, £5. Now remember, Indians were working, told verbally that they were going to be provided with this passage back. Nobody thought that they had to save. So now after the 5 or 10 years, when they went to claim their return passage back, then they are told, well, you need to have £5, or you need to pay half, or we will pay only for the man, but not for the woman and the children. And then sometimes, no, your time has passed because of the long procedure. Then they would say your time has passed, you have to pay the whole thing. So in trying to assess and understand, why the Indians left, we have to get a holistic picture of all of this and engage the notion of, was it really a voluntary movement? How voluntary was it?
And with that in
Even
mind,
though
and I want to thank you so much for helping to set that context, because it would have been so many years after knowing of indentureship, what you learn in primary school and coming up in school, then you hear other things in terms of like physically breaking looms, physically damaging people who are weaving to help set up industries. And then when you start to understand these things at a different level, it just sounds so much like it's a playbook that you see someone operating from. Okay, I'm going to destroy your industry and I'm going to set
Yes.
up my industry so that you have no choice but to further enrich my industry because you no longer have an alternative.
Yes,
You no longer
absolutely.
have that choice. But that begs the question, though, what is the how important is it that we are able to study history, we are able to learn, and we treat history as something that is living, as opposed to something that is always past tense?
Oh, that is extremely important, and not just, people would think there's this misconception, and I'm sure you're aware of it, that history is the past. What can it do for the future? And the answer is you need history for the future and the present. We cannot successfully and effectively navigate our present and hope to chart a successful path towards a future if we do not understand our history. And this has nothing to do with just Indian history. This has to do with history generally. We cannot understand what we are facing in our society today, our problems, our issues, our shortcomings, our successes, if we do not root it in its various histories. If we do not root ourselves, we must understand. We cannot hope to, as persons, as an individual, as a collective people or collective peoples, we cannot hope to have any true sense of identity if we do not understand our history, where we came from. You cannot you cannot understand a person if you do not understand, let's say, their ancestral lineage. It's like a sense of rootlessness if you don't ground yourself in that history. Through history, you will be able to understand yourself, your society, but also it will assist in problem solving because you can go back and look. Remember, as you said, history is living. It was lived at one. We might say, not we, sorry, but others might say history is the past. But we have to remember that the past was once a present. It was once alive. So the history that was written about a certain time, it concerns not just telling you, and this is what we call new history, maybe about 50, 60 years old, where it's no longer simply telling you dates and what happened. This history is now concerned with the why it happened, where, why, what, how it happened, and of course its impact. So if we look at history like that, as something living, at something so analytical, then we'll be able to understand how important a part it can play in our contemporary society, and as I said, towards charting a future effectively.
There's a Dr. Carr who talks about the momentum of memory. And if I understand it correctly, having that throughput, or there's an African term in terms of Sankofa, going back and get it, so that you, like you said, you see what has done in the past, what has
Absolutely.
worked, solutions to problems, as opposed to saying, okay, well, we're going to have to try to reinvent the wheel and then get a solution to this issue, or we're going to have to try to get somebody else's wheel to roll
Yeah.
on the road that we are using with its own idiosyncrasies and special nuances, and looking and being able to do for ourselves, knowing that we have, I think is really important. But we're going to let that breathe for a moment, take a breath, and we are going to return to this conversation. We are speaking with Senior Lecturer of Indian History and Indian Diaspora Studies at the Department of History, UWI St Augustine campus, Dr. Sherry Singh. Stay with us. We come back after this. Welcome back. I am having a great deal of fun because I think anytime I'm able to learn something, it is beautiful. And we're doing so in no small means by the insight coming from Senior Lecturer of Indian History and Indian Diaspora Studies, Dr. Sherry Singh. And we just before we took the break, we looked at the role, the importance of history, and the way that we look at history. So And I want to continue the conversation, please, because you would have written a paper or a publication rather, Paria to Prime Minister. Um, and that makes me want to ask your views on the initial to current position of East Indians in society, looking at what you would have said earlier in the conversation, not being able to read and write English. So having things told to you, things that were not necessarily 100% true, uh, from that position to where we are now. What are some of those important signposts that you think we really need to be looking at in terms of how we can even go forward from this conversation, from this position, from our current situation?
Yes, so as you use the word pariah, yeah. So we have to understand when the Indians were introduced into the society, basically because of a number of factors, they were essentially what we would call pariahs. They were living on the edge or the margins of society. Yes, so they were living on estates, but I just mentioned that they were not allowed to leave, as freely twice per year. What this did, and this is maybe a point we can discuss a little bit more later on, what this did is this kind of isolation. Yes, it did not work in favor of Indians, but it also set up the various groups in terms of their relationship with the Indians to start off on a negative note. Now, maybe I should touch on the point now because it's so relevant. But we spoke about in the push factors, but when the Indians entered into Trinidad or the Caribbean, um, there was a point, they met a point of contention. They were part of a point of contention. But the thing is, that point was not created by them or even the other largest group in society, the Africans. That point was created again by British colonialism. So this is what happened. Prior to emancipation, of course, promises were made to the formerly enslaved Africans. Um, After emancipation, the formerly enslaved Africans, the idea was that now we have free agency. Of course, we will have to work, but we will have to be paid. All right, we can ask for better, more humane conditions. So this was the general idea. Work will be done, but now we will be paid. We have our agency and we will be treated more humanely. So they put forward, the African population put forward, this is what we want, better conditions, better wages, thinking that they were the only source of labor so that British would have no choice. They hadn't a clue that already in India, which was almost part of the British Empire, parts of India, the British had already created by the, let's say, even the 1820s, a glut in the labor market. So one can argue that they were preparing beforehand to play this card. So when the Africans asked for better working conditions and better wages, guess what? They have another trump card to play, and that card would be the Indians. So here the African population thinking, we have the trump card, but they didn't. And so the British didn't tell them anything when they put their demands forward. They simply brought the Indians. Now, from the African perspective, and one can absolutely understand, they are expecting better conditions, and now they are seeing this new group of people coming into society. So these people have taken away our chances for certain kinds of improvement. They have taken away our bread and butter, and at that point, you can understand why. So the Africans did not know that the British had this supply of Indian labor. The Indians were clueless that they were now coming in to fill a space, not because there was no labor, but because British wanted to profit and they wanted a labor force that they could still control. Because there was control with indentureship, make no mistake about that. Yeah. So the British again, they played one group against the other. And we have to admit we do have racial undercurrents, and thankfully it's just undercurrents in our society. But if you ask me, I would say that this is the genesis of our racial undercurrent, how each group was pitted immediately against each other. And so the introduction of the Indians was problematic as it pertained to the African population. The Indians now were not allowed to mix with anybody, so that separatedness kept them from actually understanding each other. So that while the Indians were on the plantation, those elements fostered a sort of insularity where they thought it's better to stay by ourselves. You also had the language difference. There were a lot of differences with the Indians, the language, how they look, their cultural differences and so forth. But the initial card again was played by the British, where they played one against the other, and nothing was done to sort of smoothen out those ruffled feathers. They just left it because we always have to remember the British motto or mantra of divide and rule.
And
So
definitely something that is
yes.
just so kind of fundamental,
Mhm.
because as to your point, is not as though there was this opportunity to have this sort of mixing, integration, meeting of the minds, even if you're looking at that language barrier, because you said it's 2 times for the year that uh,
Yes. Twice
individuals
a
would have
year.
been, and this is with written permission.
Written. They had to carry that written. If they were found without it, they would be thrown in jail. They had to have that written permission with them.
So this level of, and you said divide and rule, but I think it can be described as insidious.
Yeah, there was an agenda, and it is not a very hidden agenda. There was an agenda of control. So they no longer had that kind of control over the Africans. So let's have a laboring population that we can control. Maybe definitely not like they did in enslavement, but you have control. Indians could not move. Even those Indians who had completed their periods of indenture and were now what we'd call free, they had to carry a pass with them at all times to prove that they were free. It was called a certificate of industrial residence. So if they were found without that pass, nobody would believe, the police and so on would not believe. So they would be thrown into jail.
And was that time frame of indentureship?
1845 to let's say 1920. However, we have to remember that people in Indians were indentured, let's say for 5, sometimes 10 years. So even though indentureship was terminated by 1920, you had people completing their periods of indenture from by say let's say 1855 or so, and then but most of them until maybe the 1860s, 70s would continue to re-indenture themselves, those who did not return to India.
Okay,
And
that's
then
that's that's what I'm asking
yeah.
about. Sorry, as opposed
Mhm.
to just the whole period, the collective period. I'm talking about
Yes.
individual periods. So you said
Mhm.
5 to 10 years, but
Yes, it
persons
varied
would.
again.
Okay,
Yes, yeah. Sometimes it'd be 2 years plus 1 year, sometimes it's 3 years plus 2 years. So policies kept changing. So comfortably 3 or 5 or 10.
and what would be some of the, because just looking at it from the face, I can imagine, okay, well, if because of the way that my last period was set up, I find myself free, but free by myself. I
Yes.
can see the utility of re-indenture, because these are the people that I know. This is the space that
Mhm.
I'm comfortable with.
Yes.
This is my comfortable discomfort.
Mhm. Yes. Quite true.
But what other than that, what would individuals find themselves doing? So, okay, I don't want to be indentured anymore. What was
Yes.
the next
Okay.
course of action?
So I think it's 1868, there in Trinidad, in Guyana, you had some scheme, in Jamaica, you had a different scheme. But for about 10 years or so, in Trinidad, the authorities started to offer the Indians like 10 hectares of land, 10 acres of land, sorry, to stay in lieu of their return passage, right? So Indians started to take it because remember, it wasn't technically then a free return passage. There were some details. You had to pay half, or this one would be funded and that one wouldn't be, and so forth. So, and of course, you have to remember that they left India in dire straits. Again, situations created by the British, but the point is they left India impoverished. So by let's say 10 years, 15, 20 years, they Trinidad or wherever they went, it was a space that they had gotten used to. They knew, all right, this is how it operates, and it would have been a bit better than they would have left in India. So many of them took these grants of land from the late 1860s and now settled off the estates. It was their avenue off the estates. Usually, and again, the smarts of the colonial authorities, they would give them lands very close to the estates, and they would give them the worst quality of land, swampy land. So if you get a piece of swamp land, you can't plant anything on that. You would take another 2 or 3 years to actually make it, usable. So the idea was that while they were living off the estates, colonial authorities would not have to bear those expenses. But the Indians would be still forced to work on the estates because they could not utilize the land as it was at that point. So that is why you find also, even now, you find, but more visible, let's say in up to the 1970s, 80s, you would find certain parts of Trinidad would be like Indian-based villages or pockets of Indians. And they would be relatively close to an estate, Felicity, Caroni, Page, and so forth, various parts. So this is how it's done. So that was the avenue. If you did not want to stay on estate life during the period that they were giving these lands, just for a period of about 10, 12 years, then you can take it and move off. And then Indians also started to place, and but they came with that intrinsic love for the land. They were an agricultural people. So a lot of emphasis was placed on saving money to purchase lands. That was the ultimate goal. So in addition to the lands, Indians that would have been given to them in lieu of the return passage, started to purchase lands. So by the 1880s, as soon as they could afford it, Indians now chose estate life had become unattractive. They started to move off the estate. So by the time indentureship was actually terminated, you had budding communities all over Trinidad. It's not as if they waited until 1920 and then started to build a community.
In terms of moving off that estate, we've totally gone off the rails in terms of time, but I'm very happy that you've agreed that we'll have another conversation right after this. So for the purposes of putting a bow on this conversation, we say thank you very much, Senior Lecturer of Indian History and Indian Diaspora Studies, Dr. Sherry-Ann Singh. And we're going to have another one right after, which will be played the following day. So thank you so much, and thank you for agreeing to that other conversation. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for joining us.